I want to tell you about the moment I stopped believing the official story about Antarctica. It started with a treaty, the Antarctic Treaty of 1959, which locked down an entire continent with a speed that still doesn't make sense. 12 nations, bitter Cold War enemies who couldn't agree on anything, came together within months to declare 7.8 million square miles off limits to civilian exploration. Not portions of it, not disputed territorial claims, the whole thing, enforced with a coordination that makes NATO look disorganized by comparison. I told myself it was about science, about preservation, about preventing nuclear testing in a pristine wilderness. That's what every documentary says. That's what the textbooks teach. But I kept noticing things that didn't fit. Small inconsistencies at first, redactions in declassified naval surveys, photographs with suspiciously uniform cloud cover over specific coordinates, expedition reports with entire sections missing, replaced with classification stamps. And then I found the old maps made before the treaty, before the official narrative solidified, maps showing coastal features, geological formations, and structural anomalies that modern satellite imagery does not show, or rather does not show us. What I found wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was a pattern of coordinated silence around a continent that, according to every official source, holds nothing but ice and rock, and patterns, in my experience, don't form without reason. Patterns this consistent, this geographically vast, this carefully maintained across decades, suggest intention. Let's talk about what Antarctica was before the ice. We're told it's been frozen for 34 million years, clean, simple, safe, except the ice core data tells a different story. The Younger Dryas event, 15,000 to 11,000 years ago, catastrophic cooling, then sudden warming, and buried in technical literature most people never read are anomalies. Pollen deposits in ice layers where nothing should have been growing, sediment cores showing liquid water systems, spore samples from temperate vegetation. These findings appear once in academic journals, generate brief discussion, and then stop being referenced. Not refuted, just quietly forgotten. Early expedition reports troubled me more. In 1938, a German expedition identified unusual geometric formations along the Dronning-Maudland coast, too regular for natural geology. The report recommended further investigation. No investigation was conducted. Operation High Jump in 1946, the largest Antarctic expedition ever mounted with 4,700 personnel and 13 ships, was terminated after 8 weeks instead of the planned 8 months. Admiral Byrd's declassified log contains passages about discoveries that would shake the foundations of human history. His exact words. Then the expedition ended abruptly. Personnel debriefed under strict protocols and dispersed to different assignments. Photographic records classified, equipment logs sealed. The official explanation cites weather and equipment failures, but Operation High Jump had been equipped with redundant systems specifically designed for Antarctic conditions. It had military icebreakers, aircraft carriers, submarines, resources that no purely scientific expedition would require. What did they find in those 8 weeks that required such an abrupt termination? This raises a question that the timeline keeps forcing to the surface. What did they find that required that level of coordinated silence? What was significant enough to bring 12 nations to a negotiating table within 13 years to ensure no one could go back and look again? Consider what the megalithic record shows. Sacsayhuaman in Peru, stones weighing 200 tons fitted with precision measured in millimeters. Baalbek in Lebanon, foundation stones over 800 tons. The granite boxes in Saqqara, carved from single blocks with tolerances modern engineers struggle to replicate. The conventional explanation is always manpower and ingenuity, but perhaps these structures don't fit our timeline because they weren't built in our timeline. Perhaps they were built by beings operating at a scale we've written out of history. And perhaps their primary cities are under 3 kilometers of ice on a continent no one is allowed to explore. When you cross-reference coordinates from early expeditions, the pattern becomes difficult to dismiss. In 1820, Russian explorer Bellingshausen noted coastal formations with unusual symmetry, describing them as appearing worked. In 1840, French explorer d'Urville sketched formations resembling constructed terracing, writing artificiel in faded ink. In 1902, a British expedition documented anomalous stone arrangements above the ice line. 3 expeditions, 3 nations, 3 separate decades before the Antarctic Treaty, all noting the same class of anomaly, coastal formations too regular for natural geology. Then in 1959 the treaty gets signed, and coastal surveying that would confirm or refute those observations becomes impossible outside sanctioned programs. The coordinates from those early reports cluster along a specific region now designated as geologically sensitive, requiring special authorization even for sanctioned research teams. I obtained declassified geological survey data from 1970s satellite programs through Freedom of Information requests. Early synthetic aperture radar capable of penetrating ice to image subsurface topology. The data showed returns consistent with right-angle structures beneath the ice, geometric patterns that natural formations don't produce, flagged for follow-up in 1974. The follow-up was conducted. The results were classified and remain classified. Ice-penetrating radar sends electromagnetic pulses and measures returns. Different materials reflect differently. Worked stone returns a distinct signature because of the boundaries between fitted blocks, the voids where structures create enclosed spaces. In 2001, an Ohio State research team detected subsurface returns they described as architecturally suggestive, parallel linear features, repeating geometries. Their report recommended expanded surveying. Funding was denied. The lead researcher's subsequent grant applications were rejected. By 2004, he had shifted away from Antarctic research entirely. Then there's Lake Vostok, a subglacial lake beneath 4 kilometers of ice, isolated for 15 million years, according to official timelines. When Russian teams breached it in 2012, the full results weren't published. Leaked internal communications referenced anomalies in sediment samples, compounds suggesting biological activity far more recent than expected, and sonar returns from the lakebed suggesting non-natural formations. The communications were scrubbed. Official publications make no mention. The lake remains restricted. What exists beneath the ice at Lake Vostok? What exists beneath the ice in the region where early expeditions noted worked stone and modern radar detected geometric anomalies? I don't know. I want to be clear about that. I am not claiming to know, but I am asking why the question is so consistently, so systematically shut down. Why data gets classified, why researchers get defunded, why entire research directions simply stop being pursued, and I'm asking what would be significant enough to justify a treaty that locks down an entire continent in perpetuity with enforcement mechanisms that make it functionally impossible for any civilian, any independent researcher, any entity not operating under the treaty's oversight to go and actually look. Find a topographical map of Antarctica showing bedrock beneath the ice. Look at the western coast near the Ross Sea. You'll see a broad coastal plain sheltered by mountains adjacent to what would have been a deep water harbour before the ice. Terrain perfectly suited for a large settlement, a capital. Now look at modern satellite imagery. Uniform ice. But the ice surface shows subsidence patterns, depressions that form when ice settles over voids beneath. The depressions in this region form grids, blocks, the kind of pattern satellite imagery showed over Angkor Wat and Mayan cities before excavation. I spent 8 months trying to obtain high-resolution satellite data for that region. Every request was denied on administrative grounds. The imagery exists. It's not available for civilian access. What is in that imagery that requires this level of restriction? If you were being operating at twice normal human scale, 12 to 14 feet tall, your architecture would reflect that. Doorways 15 to 20 feet tall. Wider streets scaled to your stride. Buildings constructed from larger base units because you could handle them. Cities that would show expanded geometric spacing, oversized grid work. Exactly what the subsidence patterns in Western Antarctica show. The patterns exist, they're measurable, they're documented. What requires speculation is explaining them as purely natural when every comparable pattern elsewhere has turned out to be archaeological. Every major ancient culture shares flood myths. Mesopotamia, the Americas, South Asia, the Mediterranean. The same event, a world-ending deluge, rapid sea level rise, catastrophic climate shift destroying previous civilizations. Around 11,600 years ago, global sea levels rose over 400 feet in a geologically instantaneous time frame. If you were a civilization in what is now Antarctica when the climate shifted, when ice formed, when your cities became uninhabitable within centuries, it would look exactly like every flood myth describes. Displacement, diaspora, survivors scattering to other continents carrying knowledge, building techniques, astronomical understanding, and stories of a lost homeland beneath ice. Where did the megalithic builders come from? The ones who built Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to 11,600 years ago, exactly at the Younger Dryas boundary. The ones who built Sacsayhuaman and Baalbek. Where did they acquire precise astronomical knowledge? Where did they develop masonry techniques we cannot replicate? The conventional answer is independent development through gradual cultural evolution, but that requires ignoring the timeline problem. These sites appear suddenly without clear precedent, built to sophistication that should require centuries of prior development we don't find. Or perhaps the prior development happened somewhere else, somewhere we're not allowed to look, somewhere locked beneath treaty-protected ice. Civilizations forget. We lose knowledge through catastrophe, disrupted traditions, generational entropy. The Bronze Age collapse erased writing systems. Rome's fall lost concrete formulations for over 1,000 years. But the forgetting I'm describing has a different character. Not gradual erosion of unrecorded tradition, but deliberate restriction of recorded information. Gradual forgetting leaves traces, fragmentary records, stories that persist. Deliberate restriction leaves classified data, denied requests, terminated research, redacted documents. The particular silence that forms when information exists but is actively withheld. What was known about Antarctica that informed the decision to lock it down? What understanding made treaty signatories set aside Cold War hostilities to ensure no one could investigate independently? The treaty negotiations weren't public. The discussions weren't recorded in accessible archives. We have the final document. We don't have the conversation that produced it. There may have been a civilization there. Not metaphorical lost wisdom, but an actual populated continent with cities, infrastructure, organized culture, operating at a scale removed from acceptable history, because acknowledging it would require rewriting everything we teach about human development, technological progression, the timeline of who built what and when. Perhaps it was removed not from malice but necessity. Perhaps knowledge of what exists beneath that ice, confirmation of a prior advanced culture at giant scale, was considered too destabilizing to public understanding, too disruptive to institutional authority, too dangerous to narratives that underpin how we organize society. Perhaps the decision was made quietly that the world was better off not knowing, that the ice was better left undisturbed, that some questions were better unanswered. I don't know if that's true. But the pattern of restriction, the consistency of silence, the systematic denial of access to routine scientific data, all points towards something being protected. Not the environment, not territorial claims, something underneath, something predating the ice, something significant enough that 12 nations agreed to lock it away in perpetuity. Those early expedition reports stay with me. Bellingshausen noting worked stone, D'Urville writing artificiel, the British documenting anomalous arrangements. They saw something before the treaty, before official silence. They saw enough to note it to recommend further investigation. Then the opportunity was quietly removed. The treaty was signed, restrictions implemented, and Antarctica became the one continent civilians cannot explore. Not because it's too dangerous, but because someone decided what's there is something the world isn't ready to know. What was the giant's capital city? What streets did they walk? What structures did they build? What knowledge did they carry? What were they aligning to when they oriented their cities to astronomical features? What were they doing before the ice came? And who decided with such extraordinary coordination that every nation was better off never finding out? I don't know. I won't pretend I know. But I'm going to keep asking. Because once you've seen the subsidence patterns, the radar returns, the redacted surveys, the denied requests, you cannot put them back down. The pattern is there. The restrictions are real. The silence is deafening. And somewhere beneath 3 kilometers of ice on a continent no one is allowed to investigate, the stones are still there, still arranged in grids, still forming foundations of something we're told never existed, still waiting.